Let me welcome all of you to a special edition of Hagley Does History, our extra class after the official end of the Osher semester, which I will attribute to my teaching, and the semester is still going wrong from my standpoint. But from our standpoint, we wanted to continue on and have this additional class and open it up as well to members of the Hagley staff, who are many of whom are joining and will come in as this goes forward. I'm looking forward to this greatly. Carolyn Western is our curator of exhibitions at Hagley. She's been looking into the life of Louise Pont Crowninshield, a very important person in the development of the Hagley property, as she will tell you, and someone whom I think we're providing more visibility to in the future as Hagley expands its interpretation of the property. So Carolyn, why don't you start telling us a bit more about yourself, and then we can go right into the presentation.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So I started at Hagley in 2015. I was an intern in 2013, went away for a little bit, then came back. So 2015, I started my work on the patent models. So I was a special projects cataloger and then transitioned into assistant curator for the patent model collection. And then about 7 months ago, transitioned into the curator of collections position here at Hagley. So it's been a whirlwind, but it's been a lot of fun so far.
Let me just ask everybody to mute yourself when Carolyn begins her talk. Well, why don't you just go ahead, Carolyn, and start going.
Great. So you can hear me okay?
Oh yeah, hear you just fine.
Great. All right, everyone. So again, thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm not gonna lie, I struggled a bit in deciding how to begin this presentation because you're about to meet a woman with such intense passion and personality that I don't think a single jump straight into biography would really do her justice. So instead, I'd like to try and characterize her up front for you so that you can take this feeling with you throughout our talk and kind of hold her in your mind's eye. So John Sweeney, former assistant to the director at Winnetou, characterized her like this. Louise Crowninshield had a great capacity for erasing age differences. She liked to wear big, splashy floral print dresses and wore the huge hats and furs that went along with the times. Her bearing was truly that of a grande dame. People were deferential to her, but not intimidated. People of all ages just loved her. You would never know when you saw her that she had such refined taste. The delicate colors and Sheraton furniture were at odds with her stout figure. Louise Evelina Dupont Crowninshield is a relatively unstudied and unrepresented figure, and I hope you'll forgive that I plan to somewhat gloss over the men in her life during this talk. They, of course, had a great influence on her, and she greatly on them, but I think it's time for Louise to shine a bit on her own. So now I think it's best to start from the beginning. So Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, patriarch of the Dupont family here in America, was Louise's great-great-great-grandfather. Her great-great-grandfather was Eleutherian, or E.I. Dupont, founder of the DuPont Company and Black Powder Works that Hagley Museum and Library calls home. Henry Dupont, second son of E.I., and Louisa Gerhard Dupont were Louise's grandparents. Henry was a graduate of West Point, but became head of the DuPont Company beginning in 1850. They resided at Eleutherian Mills, the DuPont family ancestral home overlooking the powder yards of the DuPont Company. Louise's parents were Henry Algernon Dupont and Mary Pauline Foster Dupont. Her father, Henry A., was also a graduate of West Point and spent more time serving there than his father did before joining the family business. Louise's parents' home was at Winterthur, just up the road from where I'm sitting today. Louise spent her childhood and girlhood there at Winterthur. She never went away to school. In fact, she had a tutor come to her. So her life revolved around those beautiful grounds and surrounding properties. Being so close, Louise would visit her grandparents at Eleutherian Mills many weekends. On those weekends, she would eat breakfast with her grandfather and then drive around with him in his gig on the farms. As for her grandmother, Louise thought she was one of the most marvelous people the world had ever known. Her time at Eleutherian Mills and along the Brandywine was always well spent. She organized a group of girls between the ages of 6 and 12, which she called the Willing Helpers. These girls, under Louise's tutelage and leadership, made clothes for babies at a nursery in Wilmington. The relationships she made with members of that group lasted a lifetime. However, one thing did drastically change for Louise when she was about 12 years old. Louise was getting ready to roast chestnuts with her cousins at her home in Winterthur on October 7th, 1890, when a series of large explosions broke windows and scattered debris throughout the house. There is an inherent risk in powder making, of course, so the family knew quickly that the explosion had come from the family's black powder works along the Brandywine. She and her family could tell, even from miles away at Winterthur, that this explosion had been large and had likely caused a lot of damage. This was the first explosion in 7 years and was felt as far away as Philadelphia. And it ultimately left the ancestral home of Eleutherian Mills abandoned. Though Louise spent the majority of her time at Winterthur, her grandmother had a summer place up in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and Louise would visit often in the summertime. This is where the next part of Louise's story takes off. There, in the late 1890s, Louise met Francis Frank Boardman Crowninshield. They were engaged in 1900 and married that same year on June 28th. So from what I've gathered so far, the Crowninshield family has an interesting history. So I definitely urge you to look them up in your free time. And I hope to add more about Frank and his ancestors' stories to my talks about Louise in the future. But for now, I'll just say that Frank was a multi-layered character. He was one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and he absolutely loved being out on the sea. But above everything, he seemed absolutely devoted to Louise. He once wrote, "I am fortunate enough in being married to an unusually good-tempered wife, one who spends most of her time doing kind things for other people, myself included." Louise and Frank moved into a house in Boston on Marlborough Street, and it was there that Louise fervently began getting involved in the charitable organizations in the area, including hospitals and the Widows Society of Boston. So the couple loved Boston, but they also fell in love with a place a little bit warmer. They had a second home in Boca Grande, Florida. And then, of course, as you'll gather in a few moments, there was Louise and Frank's other home of Eleutherian Mills. As you'll come to see, Louise got around a lot. Even though she spent much of her youth in one place, her adulthood was full of travels up and down the eastern seaboard, and she took a few vacations abroad. A letter from Pierre Dupont makes me laugh and exemplifies this point perfectly. "It will give me great pleasure to dine with you and Frank on Saturday next at Eleutherian Mills. I am not quite sure if this is the right Saturday or if the dinner is to be held at Eleutherian Mills, Boca Grande, Boyce, Virginia, or perhaps Boston. However, I shall take a sandwich with me and sit on your porch if I find there is no other provision." Their winter home in Boca Grande was called Las Olas, and it certainly seemed like a retreat for Louise and Frank. They enjoyed being out on the water, fishing, and beachcombing. Louise and Frank's families would come to visit, and a few members even purchased homes of their own down there. Louise became known as the fairy godmother of Boca Grande. She provided a health clinic and a community house for the island. She cared deeply for the community there, and the term community meant everyone. Her niece, Mrs. James Hammond, said, "She was interested in everyone. There were always people around her. She was like a magnet. People flocked to her and loved her." Louise reciprocated that love, and from what I can tell, there was absolutely no room for prejudice in her heart. So, if you visited Hagley before, then you may have already visited Eleutherian Mills, the ancestral home of the DuPont family. It was occupied first by E.I. DuPont and his family, and then occupied by succeeding generations of DuPonts until 1890. And if you remember, in 1890, there was that large explosion that ultimately forced the last resident, Louise's grandmother, to move out permanently. After that, Eleutherian Mills became a clubhouse for workmen of the company, and then ultimately fell into disrepair over time. But when the DuPont company ceased its powder-making operations along the Brandywine around 1921, word went around to family members that the houses and other properties were going to be offered for sale to the living descendants of the original owners. Louise and her father weren't really interested at first, but they decided to go to the family meeting where all of these properties were being offered. And they came away with Eleutherian Mills. I can only imagine how Louise must have felt when she saw the disrepair of Eleutherian Mills, the house that held so many wonderful memories for her. She convinced her father to buy the house for her. And so Louise and her father came to an agreement. He would purchase Eleutherian Mills and the 52 acres it sat on, with the understanding that Louise and Frank would live in it a part of each year. And so for the rest of their living days, Louise and Frank would come to Eleutherian Mills for a few months a year, usually in the spring and fall months. On deciding to buy the place in 1958, she said, "This is one of the happy accidents that brought more pleasure into my life than I could possibly describe. I had so many delightful associations with the house and its surroundings, and it was easy to go right back." Renovations began in earnest, with her father Henry coordinating much of it while Louise was in Boston or Boca Grande. Their correspondence is fun to read from this time period. I love this note to Louise from her father, dated August 30th, 1924, filling her in on the progress of the house, including that the two original marble steps worn by the feet of so many generations of the family are in position at the entrance door and give out a certain flavor of dignity and antiquity, which no modern structure could possibly have. We use these same steps to enter Eleutherian Mills today. Another letter perfectly encapsulates the influence Louise had on the decision-making process of restoring Eleutherian Mills. Her father wrote on October 3rd, 1924, "A great majority of the fair sex are content to have the question popped once, if popped by the right person. But when you arrive in Delaware, you will find that the question is to be popped to you at least 50 times, and there are as many number of minor points awaiting your decision." Louise says that she only selected furniture in Eleutherian Mills that would have been in use in the country at the time the DuPont family arrived in America from France. In 1958, she stated, "Everything is authentic and made in America. Some of the family pieces have been given back to me and have been carefully listed. All, or nearly all, I hope will remain in the house. It is my intention to leave them there." We are so fortunate that Louise took an interest and made great efforts to return family pieces to the ancestral home of Eleutherian Mills. For example, this table was owned by Victorine Dupont Bauduit, daughter of E.I. DuPont, and it was given to her at the time of her marriage in 1813 by her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Victor DuPont. Today, it lives in the Blue Room at Eleutherian Mills. These chairs with rush seats were likely made in Pennsylvania and date from around 1825. According to Mrs. Crowninshield, they had always been at Eleutherian Mills, and they are believed to have been purchased by E.I. DuPont. In the E.I. and Sophie bedroom, there is a high post bed that was most certainly owned by E.I. Hagley has in its archives a receipt for purchase. This room was used by Mrs. Crowninshield as her own bedroom, and she used this bed. As for the first floor of Eleutherian Mills, it is still very similar to how Louise Crowninshield left it. She loved the Colonial Revival style, and this is reflected through the types of things she collected throughout her life, and many of these things are displayed in the house today. So we mention the Colonial Revival a lot when we talk about Louise Crowninshield, but sometimes we do not really delve into what it means and why she liked to collect along those lines. Like most things that humans tend to do, there's some psychology behind it that explains it all. The Colonial Revival tends to convey a romantic vision of American past. Think along the lines of elegance, good taste, comfort, domesticity. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of change in America. Industrialization and immigration were changing the landscape of the United States. And essentially, the Colonial Revival was a conservative movement that longed for simpler times. Louise was in many ways conservative, though she is much too nuanced and complex of a person to be able to label her solely as such. Nevertheless, objects that portrayed the ideals of a simpler past were sought after by Colonial Revival collectors, including Louise. It's also important to note that the Colonial Revival was just that, a revival of colonial style. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many reproductions of colonial style furniture were made. So many pieces used within homes were not always authentic to colonial times. Beautiful reproductions were made, and they were made accessible to people who did not have access to authentic family heirlooms. And so the Colonial Revival style reached a much wider public, and many people were decorating their homes with reproduction colonial pieces, building and creating environments for themselves that echoed those braver, simpler times. By living amongst these things that reminded them of the past, they were closer to embodying the idealized values of craftsmanship, hard work, honesty, and integrity. Louise uses the word authentic a few times when talking about how she chose objects for her homes and for the historic homes she was instrumental in furnishing. But Louise also had a lot more privilege within the antique market, so authentic pieces were much likely more accessible to her. We can see that easily through the pieces she accumulated from her family. So I won't dig too deeply into furniture here today, but I'm looking forward to exploring her collecting style in that realm in the future. But I would like to share with you some types of objects associated with the Colonial Revival that Louise collected, which you can see many examples of in Eleutherian Mills residence today. The colonial origins of the hooked rug are debated still today, with some believing the craft originated in the Canadian Maritime provinces before gaining popularity in the New England areas. The Colonial Revival brought about renewed interest in collecting and also making hooked rugs because of their association with rural craftsmanship, domesticity, and patriotism. We have in our collection over 90 rugs that belong to Louise, many with floral or animal designs. Chalkware was known as the poor man's porcelain. During colonial times, it was difficult to obtain finer porcelain products like Staffordshire china figures. So a cheaper alternative was contrived, made of plaster of Paris with lime or gypsum. Later, during the Colonial Revival, it was viewed as American folk art and therefore was sought after by collectors. Louise also decorated her guest houses at Eleutherian Mills in the Colonial Revival style. In this image, you can just pick out the chalkware pieces sitting on the shelves in the back of the room. Ceramics such as these were the most inexpensive tableware with color decoration, made between 1780 and 1860. They were commonly found in working class homes and were usually thrown away and not passed down to successive generations. Because of this, the style became rare. The Colonial Revival created a new interest in these green-edged ware ceramics, and we've got plenty of these ceramics at Hagley because of Louise. All in all, Louise collected the things she liked, and those things that she liked were placed together to create an attractive, welcoming, and lived-in setting. She wasn't concerned that her guests, or dogs, as you can see in this photograph, might step on her antique hooked rugs. They were in use from the time she bought them until very late in her life. Her home at Eleutherian Mills was just that, a home. A home in which she entertained amongst things that made her happy. The signatures in the Eleutherian Mills guest book tell us that her guests were happy too. The renovation and furnishing of Eleutherian Mills in the 1920s launched Louise into the world of collecting and historic preservation. And she certainly didn't just dip her toes in. Just as Louise loved jumping into a pool or ocean during her leisure time, she did the same with her immersion into the world of collecting and historic preservation. It's important to note that even to this day, I'm not sure that Louise's collecting is seen as a legitimate contribution to the professional field. On the surface, this seems absurd, especially given all of her projects I'm about to briefly describe to you. But the reality is that Louise was collecting differently than her male counterparts in the 20th century, which in turn led her efforts not being recorded as thoroughly as, say, her brother Henry Francis at Winterthur. His museum and his contributions are all housed under one roof. His name is attached to that place, and everyone knows that Henry Francis is the reason for that wonderful museum's existence. Though I have to throw in here that Louise did help him out quite a bit. Louise's contributions and the ripples of her contributions, however, were scattered all over the nation. Moreover, she was usually working on a collaborative team. And knowing what I know about Louise now, she was a modest individual who rarely ever wanted to have certain projects or deeds attributed to her. She often gave objects to institutions anonymously, and it would take some serious research on the part of the institution's staff to find out from whom they had actually come from. Plus, the objects that Louise collected were deemed to be in the decorative or domestic realm, or rather, hierarchically speaking, less historically valuable. This was in comparison to her male counterparts who collected more historically valuable objects and placed them into encyclopedic museum settings, sometimes with very little context. Louise, on the other hand, always had historical context in mind. She also knew a great deal about what the public would find attractive and inviting in an historic home. Charm is a word that I see associated with Louise's collecting very often. For Louise, charm was more than a pretty thing on a shelf. Charming pieces, placed thoughtfully throughout a space, could connect people with their past and allow them to see themselves in the people of the past. She also had the ability to give credibility to these charming objects. During a time when, like I mentioned before, they were hierarchically deemed inferior. She did this through her amazing knowledge of colonial furnishings and striving for authenticity. Charles Peterson from the National Park Service said of Louise, "Louise always gave more than money. She gave ideas. She was a skilled strategist and knew her people, politics, and where to put her money." A wonderful quote from Walter Muir Whitehall, who knew Louise well from her preservation work in Salem, Massachusetts, sums this up really nicely. He says that she was a born collector who had the added gift of being able to blend possessions into a harmonious and unobtrusive whole. Her houses were packed with objects of rarity and intrinsic interest that quietly looked well together and were used with a freedom rare among collectors to make daily life pleasanter. So this quote specifically pertains to how Louise decorated her own homes in Wilmington, Marblehead, or Boca Grande. But these same principles that she held dear can be seen in her work in other historic homes she helped preserve. And as always, Louise says it perfectly. In an undated speech, she's referring to the future of historic house museums, saying that they must have the support of the visiting public. And the public will not visit anything unless it has a certain amount of charm, as well as its original beauty. The majority of sightseers are not educated up to being satisfied with the architectural features of the house alone. It is the rouge pots and sewing baskets and all the little things through which today's people feel they are connected to yesterday's people. Attention to detail, therefore, is a constant necessity. To go thoroughly through each preservation-related project that Louise spent time on would take probably the rest of eternity. So I'd just like to tease you with some of them right now. I'm excited to dig deeper into some of these projects and reach out to the institutions who had Louise's help to see what more I can find out about her. First up, Kenmore, which is located in Fredericksburg, Virginia, was the home of George Washington's sister, Betty Washington. Mrs. Crowninshield was on the Board of Regents for Kenmore beginning in 1931, before she was elected their president in 1940. Her very close friend, Bertha Benkard, worked with her to decorate the home. During the 30s and 40s, there was a transition away from volunteer ladies' associations that curated historic sites and their furnishings, in a preference for a new male-dominated professionalism. However, there were exceptions, and Kenmore was certainly one of them. The Kenmore Association recognized that Louise could offer them credibility during this transitional time. But it was more than that. Louise was able to overcome the masculinization of the historic preservation field. Influential men during this time also chose Louise to assist in projects because of her undeniable knowledge and credibility. Charles Moore, chair of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, had heard about Louise's work at Kenmore and extended an invite for her to work next at Wakefield. Wakefield, located on the former Pope's Creek plantation in Virginia, was where George Washington was born. Louise became president of the Wakefield National Memorial Association, and she gave much more to the site than just a passing interest. In writing to her to gain her assistance, Charles Moore said it seemed wise to write to Mrs. Frances Crowninshield in regard to Wakefield work. It was not money that we needed, but interest, good judgment, and knowledge. Also the flexibility to give charm to a room even with small things. Louise forcefully took charge and furnished the memorial house at Wakefield to reflect a well-off 18th century plantation family, mostly out of her own expense. And closer home here in Delaware, Louise played an integral part in the furnishing of the Dutch House in Old Newcastle. She was a director within the Delaware Society for the Preservation of Antiquities. And in their meeting minutes from November 2nd, 1938, Louise stated that she was gathering the furniture for the old Dutch house. She said that she was strenuously opposed to placing a single piece of furniture in the house unless it was of the proper type and period. It was voted to give Mrs. Crowninshield full powers to furnish the house at her own discretion. Louise was also a board member of the Marblehead Historical Society. Though when she began with the organization, it said that she had a hard time and was not given a good welcome from the people who were initially in control. This probably had to do with the fact that Louise and Frank were summer people and were looked at as outsiders. However, she funded repairs, painting, and refurbishing of interior rooms at Lee Mansion, and it said that she gave over 200 objects. In Louise fashion, she was able to win the Marbleheaders over by her energy, boundless enthusiasm, her knowledge of historical things, and her exemplary artistic taste in arranging them. She is an inspiration to us all. She has the most wonderful eye for detail. When she comes in, we go to some part of the exhibition halls and pictures are straightened, labels adjusted, cases moved, and exhibits tinkered. And lo and behold, a fair exhibit is transformed into an excellent one. All these things she accomplishes with the greatest kindness and good humor. And perhaps the penultimate home to be associated with, Louise was asked to be a member of the committee to redecorate the White House during President Truman's administration. And a quick little story about this. In 1957, Louise's brother, Henry Francis, was asked by Jacqueline Kennedy to lead the First Lady's Fine Arts Committee and oversee the restoration of the White House during that time period. While there, HF noticed two lovely tables in the green room. Upon inspection, he saw that they were generously donated by his sister Louise, as she was asked for her professional efforts some years before he was. If all of this wasn't enough, Louise was also instrumental in the founding of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. At first, Louise was active in the National Council for Historic Sites and Buildings. This was an organization whose goal was to promote interest in historic preservation all around the United States, and they were ultimately responsible for organizing the proposed National Trust for Historic Preservation. At the first meeting, Louise gave remarks that are just so perfectly Louise. I feel that this is a most worthwhile organization. When I was asked to join it last spring, I was thrilled beyond words because I thought nothing had happened in this country for a long time that would lead to so much that was really wonderful for the country. But I also think it is a funny organization because I don't see why, when I look around this room particularly and see so many notable people, they should have suddenly picked on me. I had a telegram from General Grant. He asked if I would speak, and I was perfectly amazed. And my husband said, "Oh yes, you must go." I was going to say I had a broken leg or something. However, I'm very happy to be here, and I think it is quite wonderful that I was chosen. I hope you think so after I have finished. In 1949, President Truman signed legislation creating the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I'll only give you one guess as to who was approached early on to serve on the executive committee. Louise's name was apparently brought alongside Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and Dwight Eisenhower. As part of the executive committee, Louise made it a priority to include a non-discrimination clause in the trust's official policies. With her influence, it was easily decided that the National Trust for Historic Preservation would not accept any properties with restrictions as to who could visit the property. It is reported that Louise was shocked that anyone would try to discriminate against a visitor to a public building. Eventually, the National Council and National Trust merged together into one organization. Louise was asked to be the last president of the council before that merger. Her response will always amaze me. "I don't think it is suitable. I am old-fashioned. I think a committee position should be held by a man." Well, nevertheless, she did become president. No one would take her no for an answer. Throughout her time on the council, Louise was an extreme advocate for her organization. She directed members of the trust to carry membership forms with them at all times when out in the public. Her efforts are a reminder to all of us to be advocates for the institutions or organizations we serve and love. It is no wonder that after her death in 1958, the National Trust instituted the Louise Pont Crowninshield Award. To this day, this award is the Trust's highest national recognition and is given only to those individuals who have shown indisputable evidence of superlative achievement over time in the preservation and interpretation of our cultural, architectural, or maritime heritage. Through my research, I have come to realize that Louise DuPont Crowninshield is the reason I am able to come to you today from my office on Hagley Museum's property. She lived a grand and bold life, even if her personality, to our eyes today, bordered on too modest. It's our job now here at Hagley to tell her story to the best of our ability. Here we have the opportunity to bring her accomplishments together in one place. In fact, in the place where much of her accomplishments started. I'll end my formal presentation with this quote from Louise herself. When I was called on the telephone by Pierre some years ago to know if I would give Eleutherian mills to a foundation, I was completely bowled over. I felt as though I had been turned out on the street and would have nowhere to go and was bereft a home. I was very sad about it. But having a share, though very small I fear, of the DuPont common sense, and having the ineradicable belief that everything Pierre thought, said, and did, except for not liking dogs, was absolutely right, I soon realized what a wonderful idea it would be to save the Brandywine for posterity. For the ordinary people like myself, it is a source of unending amazement and interest. But before I officially end today, I did want to leave you with a highlight of a really special project that we have going on here at Hagley. So I know I didn't delve too deeply into Louise Crownenshield's interests in garden and horticulture. I had to stop myself somewhere. I'll note now that Louise was an active member in the Garden Club of America since 1920. She loved fresh flowers and gardens, and those fresh flowers were always present in her homes when she occupied them. One thing that many visitors do not know about this marvelous garden Louise and Frank built on the steep slope below Eleutherian Mills. The Crowninshield Garden was designed to be a place of intentional ruin. The tiered garden contains Italianate pools, columns, statuary, and colonnades that were purposely aged and patented. This is a multi-layered space, as it sits upon the industrial ruins of the black powder refinery. To design a ruined garden in this spot was no mistake. Louise incorporated some of the items used for the refinery into her garden as decoration. Today, the garden as it was during her lifetime is also left in ruin. So essentially, it's a ruin within a ruin within a ruin. But Hagley has big plans. Paul Orpello, Hagley's Director of Gardens and Horticulture, is planning a restoration of the Crowninshield Garden. He is uncovering the ruins and uncovering the flowers and plants that have laid dormant underbrush for so long. So please be on the lookout for updates from Hagley about this exciting project. The garden is currently closed to the public, but you won't want to miss your chance to be one of the first to see a restored Crowninshield garden. Thank you so much, everyone.